I want to go back to when some of these guys that we were discussing here, whether it's Jalen Hurts, Josh Allen, when they were pre-draft prospects, when they were coming out of college, what did you, not to put you on the spot here, but what did you think about their professional hopes and what they projected to be as NFL quarterbacks specifically?
Well, I was dead wrong on Josh Allen because a couple of things. So his completion numbers were pretty modest, to put it best. He was in the mid 50s. And when Wyoming played Power Five opposition, his numbers were not very good. And I think his junior year, he actually had a handful of NFL guys on that offense. Now, the senior year, not as much. But I, like a lot of my colleagues who cover college football, I think was pretty cynical when it comes to, ooh, scouts love this throw.
Yes.
There's definitely wow stuff on film, but I didn't think there was going to be enough consistency and just, he was going to be accurate enough to be a big time NFL starter. And into his rookie year, it was interesting because I've only done one NFL game as a sideline reporter. My crew did a Bills-Lions game, which, while it was Josh Allen against Matthew Stafford, it was a terrible game, or else my crew won it at that time. And so it was deep into December, and his best weapon at the time was a guy named Robert Foster, who
I remember.
Very, like super fast, former five-star guy, kind of struggled adapting to the offense and everything, but he had speed, and they had no running backs. I mean, they were, basically at that point, Daboll, to his credit, did a lot of really good work, leaning on his legs. I mean, he's almost a tight end size guy, and they were functional. I got back from that trip just working, in the meetings and around him. And I remember I told Stu Mandel, the guy I host the Audible with, who was also very skeptical of Josh Allen. And I said, you know what? I think we might be wrong on this one, because they really loved him. They talked him up so much in the meetings and privately and different things. And we had, Daboll was really great with us because my analyst in the crew was Brady Quinn, who'd been with him multiple stops, and he knows Daboll really well. And it was interesting to hear how they talked about him. And so it's been interesting to see just what he's become in the NFL, because I don't know of anybody who covers college football who saw that coming.
And what about Jalen Hurts, which I think for you is particularly interesting because you had a lot of interaction with Jalen Hurts. You were doing a lot of his games. You guys had a lot of conversations. So what did you think, as somebody who was kind of tabbed as a day two pick and would be a project or some sort of long-term projection in the NFL, no matter where he went? What did you think about him as kind of a pre-draft outlook?
He was very interesting to me because I covered him a little at Alabama, but actually a lot at Oklahoma, and did a bunch of his games. And so on Tuesdays, sometimes they would give me Jalen Hurts and we talk, and he was super smart, and he came across as much, much more mature than the average 20-year-old, which I think is what he was at the time. And so, he was really deep, and I knew, coach's kid. Like, I think that one of the interesting things in looking back, because I've had conversations with some people who were around him at Alabama who coached him, was he was almost the opposite side of the coin from Tua, in terms of Tua might not have known what was going on and what he was supposed to do with the ball, but he would make a trigger and it'd jump out of his hand and get there. Whereas Jalen might have known where he was supposed to go with the ball, but he would hold it and just it was a little bit hesitant, not because he didn't know what to do with it. It was just it just didn't flow as easily at that point. Now, he made a ton of plays, and he was a great leader for them. But then he gets to Oklahoma, and obviously he was a really good fit with what Lincoln Riley was going to ask him to do. So you saw a lot of really good things in him. What he would, in our conversations, it was almost like there was questions that I might ask, and then he might offer some other stuff to go, as if he'd say, I can see you're not thinking about this part. Let me point this out to you. And it would be like, Kyler, and without him saying it directly as this, Kyler and Baker Mayfield had a year behind the scenes to pick up an offense, to get to know their teammates. I didn't have any of that. He didn't say it as bluntly as that. He just kind of put it in front of me, like, hey, why don't you think about this? And so I was I don't know if I say all the way a believer in him. If you told me he was going to be a mid first round pick, I'd be like, yeah. I mean, he's smart, he's super strong, he's athletic. I don't know, is he going to be accurate enough to be an elite quarterback? We'll see. I don't know. I was, I knew he had all the intangibles, but what's been fun to see is, again, and I think this is a little bit, it's not Dayball, but what he got with a place where they decided, you know what, we're going to major in what he's really comfortable in and he's really good at. And he is he has worked himself into being an elite quarterback. And loved watching the Eagles. I root for them, because of some of the people I know who are now on that team and having covered them. And he's certainly one of them. I just think he was a very misunderstood guy. And so there was a time when he was a counselor at the Elite 11, and he was there with Tua. It was right, it was right after they won the national title. And even though I mean there may be a year difference in age, like the way he spoke to people was just so, like there was a lot of wisdom in him. It's just not a term that I feel like I would use to describe a lot of players that I cover, not because they're not smart, they're just young. And he was different. So, did I think he was going to lead a team to a Super Bowl within a couple of years? No. But I'm not shocked that he's turned out to be a really, really good quarterback and a guy people have a ton of respect for.
I think the description that you used in a piece that you wrote about Jalen earlier this year is that some guys, when they're a little bit more mature in college, they're 21 going on 25. You can see that. He was 25 going on Nick Saban in terms of some of the wisdom and the outlook that he had, which I thought was a very good way of putting it. So that misunderstanding maybe of what Jalen Hurts was, I want to get into some broader maybe misunderstandings that we've had about some of these guys, maybe what we missed as part of the process, whether it was these guys as college players or even in their first couple years in the NFL, that could give us a window into what is now possible. So as you look at Josh Allen, Jalen Hurts, some of these other guys that have gotten better at the position and kind of risen to this borderline elite level, but hadn't been there the whole time, what sort of commonalities have you started to pick out? And what do you think that can tell us about some other guys that might be on a similar trajectory?
I think that it's not a cookie cutter deal, right? I've been so impressed by what Dayball did, even with the Giants this year with Daniel Jones. And I think it's something like, I don't know how flexible, and I'm not saying they were totally inflexible. You cover the NFL much more than I do. And I'm covering it almost backwards because I covered into the draft and keep up on who these guys were that I covered. But I just feel like I go back to, I grew up a Steelers fan a long, long time ago. And I remembered, I was as a little kid. So it's not like I knew the inner workings of how the Steelers operated, but I remember hearing these NFL films, sound bites from Terry Bradshaw talking about Chuck Noll and how Terry Bradshaw would talk about him. And, as if to say, if you just pat me on the butt one time, I'll lift the world for you, kind of thing. And I think a lot of times maybe it was old school coaching that was just like, hey, this is going to be my way. Can you conform to it? And I think somewhere along the way, certainly with Bill Walsh and the West Coast offense, certainly was a great fit for Joe Montana. You'd see some of that. And I think you definitely see it with Andy Reid, even though Andy Reid's an older guy, what he's able to do to get his players to be at their best. I think that is something that kind of was a change. Like when Patrick Mahomes came in, I mean, he went into the perfect situation with the perfect coach, and he's bringing a lot with him. And I think that was an eye opener for a lot of people in the NFL, because I just think before it was like, okay, this guy's not quite what we thought, or he can't learn it, or he's this, or he's that, as opposed to what can we do to make it work, and because so many, the one commonality I see with a lot of guys who are thriving now, and most of them are under 30, is the coaches are allowing them to major in what they're really, really good at, as opposed to, no, that's a college thing or whatever. I mean, I just think from to try to have all these guys try to play quarterback like Tom Brady does, or did in the early days of the Patriots, I think was setting a lot of guys up to fail who shouldn't fail. right? And so I think it's a hard it's a hard equation for a lot of teams, because I think they're spending all these money on coaches and there's a certain system, and then if a guy gets hurt, then what do you do? But I think that's the biggest difference, is you're seeing teams really buy in and say, okay, what can we do to give this guy the best chance to flourish? That's why I can't wait to watch the Colts this year, because I
Yeah.
know what kind of super freak athlete they've got, and they just drafted. And I know that the head coach is really good at, whether it's Justin Herbert in San Diego, or LA, or wherever the Chargers were that year, or this this past time with Jalen. I know he's really good with playing to the strengths of his guy.
If we're trying to project forward to what the end result is, Jalen Hurts getting this type of contract, Josh Allen becoming like an MVP level quarterback, that's kind of like the finishing point of the development. I think more coaches around the league are helping their quarterbacks in the early stages of the development in two different ways. One, it's having them incorporate college concepts just to make them comfortable in year one, year two, before you've mastered everything. And we've had examples of that going back to RG3 with Kyle Shanahan, right? Like there's this new school of coaches being willing to do that. What Joe Burrow did with his first season in Cincinnati, and some of the stuff they allowed him to lean on. And we've seen that in so many different ways. What the Ravens built around Lamar Jackson. I think so many coaches around the league now are asking, what can my guy do well, not what can't he do well? And I think that early on, that allows these teams to kind of build these hyper-specific offenses around their strengths, and kind of gives them like an intermediate period on the way to becoming the quarterbacks that they hopefully will become. And I think that's been a huge part of it. But I also think that that intermediate stage, there's a different type of quarterback that's being deployed now. And that type of quarterback's athleticism also allows them to kind of navigate that period. If you can do stuff on the ground with your legs, if you can scramble, if you can kind of solve these problems in different ways, then that helps kind of stage 1 of 10 in what your development is going to become. So I think the types of athletes being deployed and the plans for those athletes are different than they've probably ever been. And that's why I think that if you're looking at a Josh Allen, a Jalen Hurts, maybe eventually an Anthony Richardson, it's not going to be maybe one or two isolated cases of these kind of non-traditional guys improving in ways that we've never seen before, because I think they're just more factors lining up in their favor than we've ever seen.
I would agree. There's two things that when you were talking, I feel like, and maybe I'm wrong, but I thought you were a Bears fan or you grew up in Chicago. So I know there's some kind of thing, right?
Yes.
And you have one of these guys who is an ultra elite athlete, who has, like, I'm interested to see what happens. I did a bunch of Ohio State games when Justin Fields was there, and he is, I mean, I don't know. Lamar is a phenomenal runner. I'm trying to think of anybody I've seen who is like a high level college quarterback who can run any better than him. I'm going to take Cam Newton away because he's, he's an enormous athlete. But in the last, 8 years, I mean, he's really fast. Like, there's certain guys, and I don't know what that threshold is, who can outrun NFL linebackers. Like, this is one who can. Like, back when Tebow was coming out, that was one who couldn't. I mean, he couldn't outrun defensive ends. So the stuff he could do in college and get away with, and that was his security blanket, that turned out, that, fizzled out. Now is, Justin Fields, he can outrun almost everybody on the field, probably. And I think what they do with him will be interesting. But the backside of that, for me, is going to be, you have a quarterback like Hendon Hooker, who really got Tennessee football out of a decade-long ditch. And he did it by playing this version of the Baylor offense, which had totally non-traditional path, routes and concepts that were very different. And so we've seen a bunch of players who came out of that system bust in the NFL. Corey Coleman, receiver, who tore up the Big 12. He just wasn't polished enough as a receiver by the time I think the Browns drafted him, and it didn't work out. But now I think, like, Hendon Hooker coming off injury is going to have, because he's coming off injury, will have, that year or so to acclimate. And I think he's smart enough because he came from a different system before he got to Tennessee. But I think why I call it the backside of this is, if he goes somewhere, and it won't happen, I don't think he'll have a chance to prove whether he can really flourish in the NFL by the time the next draft comes around, because there's a bigger quarterback with an even bigger arm coming out of Tennessee next year in Joe Milton. who did not do well at Michigan, but has a chance to, a second act at Tennessee this year where he has people really excited. And he has somewhat in the realm of Josh Allen kind of tools. He's about the same size. His arm is of that caliber. The accuracy is some concern. But then, like I said, you're getting now to the point where it's like, okay, how do we cater to this guy because he's not Tom Brady, because, he's not out of that 1980s, 90s mold of the quarterback who is not cookie cutter, but they came up a certain way and they weren't beating you with their legs was not their first option. It wasn't even their third option.
I think the thing is with all of these guys, it's understanding that eventually they're going to have to transcend that one thing they do really well. They're going to have to step outside of that eventually. It's kind of embracing what they do maybe in the first 2-3 years of their career, but understanding that it's on the way to being a more complete quarterback.